On August 16, 1968, I was handed a book written by a certain Abbé Vallée, le manuscrit de Dom Adson de Melk, traduit en français d'Apes et l'édition de Dom J. Mabillan, auxiliary presses de l'Abbé de la Source, Paris, 1842. Supplemented by historical information that was actually quite scant, the book claimed to reproduce faithfully a 14th-century manuscript that, in its turn, had been found in the monastery of Melk by the great 18th-century man of learning, to whom we owe so much information about the history of the Benedictine order. The scholarly discovery, mine, the third in chronological order, entertained me while I was in Prague, waiting for a dear friend. 6 days later Soviet troops invaded that unhappy city. I managed, not without adventure, to reach the Austrian border at Linz, and from there I journeyed to Vienna, where I met my beloved, and together we sailed up the Danube. In a state of intellectual excitement, I read with fascination the terrible story of Adso of Melk, and I allowed myself to be so absorbed by it that, almost in a single burst of energy, I completed a translation, using some of those large notebooks from the Papeterie Joseph Joubert in which it is so pleasant to write if you use a felt-tip pen. And as I was writing, we reached the vicinity of Melk, where, perched over a bend in the river, the handsome stift stands to this day, after several restorations during the course of the centuries. As the reader must have guessed, in the monastery library I found no trace of Adso's manuscript. Before we reached Salzburg, one tragic night in a little hotel on the shores of the Munn Sea, my traveling companionship was abruptly interrupted, and the person with whom I was traveling disappeared, taking Abbé Vallée's book, not out of spite, but because of the abrupt and untidy way in which our relationship ended. And so I was left with a number of manuscript notebooks in my hand, and a great emptiness in my heart. A few months later, in Paris, I decided to get to the bottom of my research. Among the few pieces of information I had derived from the French book, I still had the reference to its source, exceptionally detailed and precise. Vetra analecta, sive collectio veterum aliquot operum and opusculorum omnis generis, Carmenum, Epistolarum, Diplomatum, Epitaphiorum, and cum itinia Germanico, adnotationibus and aliquot disquisitionibus RPD Joannis Mobilum, Presbyteri AC Monachi ORD Sancti Benedictii Congregation S. Mori, Nova Editio, qui accessori Babyloniae Vita and aliquot opuscula, Silicet dissertatio de Pain Eucharistico, asimo et fermentato, ad eminentis. Cardinalum Bona. Subjuncita opusculum Ildefonsi Hispaniensis Episcopi de Eadem Argumento et Usbii Romani ad Theophilum Gaulam Epistola, de cultu Sanctorum Ignotorum. Perisias, Abad Levesque, ad puntum S. Michaelis, MDCCXXI, cum privilegio regis. I quickly found the Vesira Analecta at the Bibliothèque Saint Geneviève, but to my great surprise the edition I came upon differed from the description in 2 details. First, the publisher, who was given here as Montalant, ad repam pp Augustinianorum, proct pontum S. Michaelis, and also the date, which was 2 years later. I needn't add that these Analecta did not comprehend any manuscript of Adso or Adson of Melk. On the contrary, as anyone interested can check, they are a collection of brief or medium-length texts, whereas the story transcribed by Vallée ran to several hundred pages. At the same time, I consulted illustrious medievalists such as the dear and unforgettable Etienne Gilson, but it was evident that the only Vetera Analecta were those I had seen at Saint Geneviève. A quick trip to the Abbaye de la Source, in the vicinity of Passy, and a conversation with my friend Domon Larnestet further convinced me that no Abbé Vallée had published books on the Abbey's presses, for that matter, non-existent. French scholars are notoriously careless about furnishing reliable bibliographical information, but this case went beyond all reasonable pessimism. I began to think I had encountered a forgery. By now the Vallée volume itself could not be recovered, or at least I didn't dare go and ask it back from the person who had taken it from me. I had only my notes left, and I was beginning to have doubts about them. There are magic moments, involving great physical fatigue and intense motor excitement, that produce visions of people known in the past, en mi retrocant CS details, quien sueza mi demanda essils sunt reals, ou bien si j'ai les rêves. As I learned later from the delightful little book of the Abbé de Bucquoy, there are also visions of books as yet unwritten. If something new had not occurred, I would still be wondering where the story of Adso of Melk originated. But then, in 1970, in Buenos Aires, as I was browsing among the shelves of a little antiquarian bookseller on Corrientes, not far from the more illustrious Patio del Tango of that great street, I came upon the Castilian version of a little work by Milo Temesvar, on the use of mirrors in the game of chess. It was an Italian translation of the original, which, now impossible to find, was in Georgian, Tbilisi, 1934. And here, to my great surprise, I read copious quotations from Adso's manuscript. Though the source was neither Vallée nor Mobilin, it was Father Athanasius Kircher, but which work? A scholar, whom I prefer not to name, later assured me that, and he quoted indexes from memory, the great Jesuit never mentioned Adso of Melk. But Temesvar's pages were before my eyes, and the episodes he cited were the same as those of the Vallée manuscript. The description of the labyrinth in particular left no room for doubt. I concluded that Adso's memoirs appropriately share the nature of the events he narrates, shrouded in many, shadowy mysteries, beginning with the identity of the author and ending with the abbey's location, about which Atso is stubbornly, scrupulously silent. Conjecture allows us to designate a vague area between Pomposa and Conques, with reasonable likelihood that the community was somewhere along the central ridge of the Apennines, between Piedmont, Liguria, and France. As for the period in which the events described take place, we are at the end of November 1327. The date of the author's writing, on the other hand, is uncertain. Inasmuch as he describes himself as a novice in 1327 and says he is close to death as he writes his memoirs, we can calculate roughly that the manuscript was written in the last or next to last decade of the 14th century. On sober reflection, I find few reasons for publishing my Italian version of the obscure, neo-Gothic French version of a 17th century Latin edition of a work written in Latin by a German monk toward the end of the 14th century. First of all, what style should I employ? The temptation to follow Italian models of the period had to be rejected as totally unjustified. Not only does Atso write in Latin, but it is also clear from the whole development of the text that his culture, or the culture of the abbey, which clearly influences him, dates back even further. It is manifestly a summation, over several centuries, of learning and stylistic quirks that can be linked with the late medieval Latin tradition. Atso thinks and writes like a monk who has remained impervious to the revolution of the vernacular, still bound to the pages housed in the library he tells about, educated on patristic scholastic texts, and his story, apart from the 14th century references and events, which Atso reports with countless perplexities and always by hearsay, could have been written, as far as the language and the learned quotations go, in the 12th or 13th century. On the other hand, there is no doubt that, in translating Atso's Latin into his own Neo-Gothic French, Vallée took some liberties, and not only stylistic liberties. For example, the characters speak sometimes of the properties of herbs, clearly referring to the Book of Secrets attributed to Albertus Magnus, which underwent countless revisions over the centuries. It is certain that Atso knew the work, but the fact remains that passages he quotes from it echo too literally both formulas of Paracelsus and obvious interpolations from an edition of Albertus unquestionably dating from the Tudor period. 1 However, I discovered later that during the time when Vallée was transcribing, the manuscript of Atso, 18th century editions of the Grand and the Petit Albert II now irreparably corrupt, was circulating in Paris. In any case, how could I be sure that the text known to Atso or the monks whose discussions he recorded did not also contain, among glosses, scholia, and various appendices, annotations that would go on to enrich subsequent scholarship? Finally, was I to retain in Latin the passages that Abbé Vallée himself did not feel it opportune to translate, perhaps to preserve the ambience of the period? There were no particular reasons to do so, except a perhaps misplaced sense of fidelity to my source. I have eliminated excesses, but I have retained a certain amount. And I fear that I have imitated those bad novelists who, introducing a French character, make him exclaim parbleu and la femme, la femme. In short, I am full of doubts. I really don't know why I have decided to pluck up my courage and present, as if it were authentic, the manuscript of Atso of Melk. Let us say it is an act of love. Or, if you like, a way of ridding myself of numerous, persistent obsessions. I transcribe my text with no concern for timeliness. In the years when I discovered the Abbé Vallée volume, there was a widespread conviction that one should write only out of a commitment to the present, in order to change the world. Now, after 10 years or more, the man of letters, restored to his loftiest dignity, can happily write out of pure love of writing. And so I now feel free to tell, for sheer narrative pleasure, the story of Atso of Melk, and I am comforted and consoled in finding it immeasurably remote in time, now that the waking of reason has dispelled all the monsters that its sleep had generated, gloriously lacking in any relevance for our day, atemporally alien to our hopes and our certainties. For it is a tale of books, not of everyday worries, and reading it can lead us to recite, with a Kempis, the great imitator, in omnibus requiem quisavi, et nascum in vini nisi in angulo cum libro. January 5, 1980. Nones. In which William speaks to Atso of the great river of heresy, of the function of the simple within the church, of his doubts concerning the possibility of knowing universal laws, and almost parenthetically he tells how he deciphered the necromantic signs left by Venantius. I found William at the forge, working with Nicholas, both deeply involved in their task. On the counter they had laid out a number of tiny glass discs, perhaps originally intended as parts of a window. With instruments they had reduced some of these to the desired thickness. William was holding them up before his eyes, testing them. Nicholas, for his part, was issuing instructions to the smiths for making the fork in which the correct lenses would be set. William was grumbling, irritated because so far the most satisfactory lens was an emerald color, and, as he said, he did not want parchments to seem meadows to him. Nicholas went off to supervise the smiths. As William tried out the various discs, I told him of my dialogue with Salvatore. The man has had various experiences, he said. Perhaps he actually was with the Dorsinians. The abbey really is a microcosm, and when we have Pope John's envoys and Brother Michael here, we'll be complete. Master, I said to him, I understand nothing. About what, Atso? First, about the differences among heretical groups. But I'll ask you about that later. Now I am tormented by the problem of difference itself. When you were speaking with Ubertino, I had the impression you were trying to prove to him that all are the same, saints and heretics. But then, speaking with the abbot, you were doing your best to explain to him the difference between one heretic and another, and between the heretical and the orthodox. In other words, you reproached Ubertino for considering different those who were basically the same, and the abbot for considering the same those who were basically different. William set the lenses on the table for a moment. My good Azzo, he said, we will try now to make some distinctions, and we may as well use the terms of the school of Paris for our distinguishing. So, they say all men have the same substantial form, am I right? Of course, I said, proud of my knowledge, men are animals but rational, and the property of man is the capacity for laughing. Excellent. But Thomas is different from Bonaventure. Thomas is fat while Bonaventure is thin, and it may even be that Hugh is bad while Francis is good, and Aldemar is phlegmatic while Agilolf is bilious. Or am I mistaken? No, that is the case, beyond any doubt. Then this means there is identity in different men as to their substantial form, and diversity as to the accidents, or as to their superficial shape. That is so, unquestionably. When I say to Ubertino that human nature itself, in the complexity of its operations, governs both the love of good and the love of evil, I am trying to convince Ubertino of the identity of human nature. When I say to the abbot, however, that there is a difference between a Catharist and a Waldensian, I am insisting on the variety of their accidents. And I insist on it because a Waldensian may be burned after the accidents of a Catharist have been attributed to him, and vice versa. And when you burn a man you burn his individual substance and reduce to pure nothing that which was a concrete act of existing, hence in itself good, at least in the eyes of God, who kept him in existence. Does this seem to you a good reason for insisting on the differences? The trouble is, I said, I can no longer distinguish the accidental difference among Waldensians, Catharists, the poor of Lyons, the Humiliati, the Begards, Joachimites, Paterins, Apostles, poor Lombards, Arnaldists, Williamites, followers of the free spirit, and Luciferans. What am I to do? Oh, poor Azzo, William said, laughing and giving me an affectionate slap on the nape, you're not really wrong. You see, it's as if, over the last 2 centuries, and even earlier, this world of ours had been struck by storms of intolerance, hope, and despair, all together. No, that's not a good analogy. Imagine a river, wide and majestic, which flows for miles and miles between strong embankments, where the land is firm. At a certain point, the river, out of weariness, because its flow has taken up too much time and too much space, because it is approaching the sea, which annihilates all rivers in itself, no longer knows what it is, loses its identity. It becomes its own delta. A major branch may remain, but many break off from it in every direction, and some flow together again, into one another, and you can't tell what begets what, and sometimes you can't tell what is still river and what is already sea. If I understand your allegory, the river is the city of God, or the kingdom of the just, which is approaching the millennium, and in this uncertainty it no longer remains secure, false and true prophets are born, and everything flows into the great plain where Armageddon will take place. That isn't exactly what I was thinking. I was trying to explain to you how the body of the church, which for centuries was also the body of all society, the people of God, has become too rich and wide, and it carries along the dross of all the countries it has passed through, and it has lost its own purity. The branches of the delta are, if you like, so many attempts of the river to flow as quickly as possible to the sea, that is, to the moment of purification. My allegory was meant only to tell you how the branches of heresy and the movements of renewal, when the river is no longer intact, are numerous and become mingled. You can also add to my poor allegory the image of someone who is trying to reconstruct the banks of the river with brute strength, but cannot do so. And some branches of the delta silt up, others are redirected to the river by artificial channels, still others are allowed to flow, because it is impossible to restrain everything and it is better for the river to lose a part of its water and still maintain its course, if it wants to have a recognizable course. I understand less and less. So do I. I'm not good at speaking in parables. Forget this story of the river. Try instead to understand that many of the movements you mentioned were born at least 200 years ago and are already dead, yet others are recent. But when heretics are discussed, they are all mentioned together. True, and this is one of the ways heresy spreads and one of the ways it is destroyed. Again, I don't understand. God, how difficult it is. Very well. Imagine you are a reformer of morals and you collect some companions on a mountaintop, to live in poverty. And after a while you see that many come to you, even from distant lands, and they consider you a prophet, or a new apostle, and they follow you. Have they really come there for you or for what you say? I don't know. I hope so. Why otherwise? Because from their fathers they have heard stories of other reformers, and legends of more or less perfect communities, and they believe this is that and that is this. And so every movement inherits the offspring of others. Of course, because the majority of those who flock after reformers are the simple, who have no subtlety of doctrine. And yet moral reform movements originate in different places and ways and with different doctrines. For example, The Catharists and the Waldensians are often mixed up. But there is a great difference between them. The Waldensians preached a moral reform within the church. The Catharists preached a different church, a different view of God and morality. The Catharists thought the world was divided between the opposing forces of good and evil, and they had built a church in which the perfect were distinguished from simple believers, and they had their sacraments and their rites. They had built a very rigid hierarchy, almost like that of our own Holy Mother, and they didn't for a moment think of destroying every form of power. Which explains to you why men in command, landowners, feudal lords, also joined the Catharists. Nor did they think of reforming the world, because the opposition between good and evil for them can never be settled. The Waldensians, on the contrary, and along with them the Arnaldists, or poor Lombards, wanted to construct a different world on an ideal of poverty, and this is why they received the outcasts and lived in community with the labor of their hands. But why, then, are they confused and spoken of as the same evil weed? I told you, what makes them live is also what makes them die. The movements grow, gather in simple people who have been aroused by other movements and who believe all have the same impulse of revolt and hope, and they are destroyed by the inquisitors, who attribute to one the errors of the other, and if the sectarians of one movement commit a crime, this crime will be attributed to each sectarian of each movement. The inquisitors are mistaken, rationally speaking, because they lump contradictory doctrines together. They are right, according to others' irrationality, because when a movement of, say, Arnaldists springs up in one city, it is swelled by those who would have been or have been Catharists or Waldensians elsewhere. Fra Dorsino's apostles preached the physical destruction of clerics and lords, and committed many acts of violence. The Waldensians are opposed to violence, and so are the Fraticelli. But I am sure that in Fra Dorsino's day there were many in his group who had previously followed the preachings of the Fraticelli or the Waldensians. The simple cannot choose their personal heresy, adso. They cling to the man preaching in their land, who passes through their village or stops in their square. This is what their enemies exploit. To present to the eyes of the people a single heresy, which perhaps may suggest at the same time the renunciation of sexual pleasure and the communion of bodies, is good preaching technique. It shows the heretics as one jumble of diabolical contradictions which offend common sense. So there is no relationship among them, and it is the devil's deception that makes a simple man who would like to be a Joachimite or a spiritual fall into the hands of the Catharists, and vice versa. No, that is not quite it. Let's try again from the beginning, adso. But I assure you, I am attempting to explain to you something about which I myself am not sure I possess the truth. I think the mistake is to believe that the heresy comes first, and then the simple folk who join it, and damn themselves for it. Actually, first comes the condition of being simple, then the heresy. What do you mean? You have a clear conception of the people of God. A great flock, good sheep and bad sheep, kept in order by mastiffs, the warriors, or the temporal power, the emperor, and the overlords, under the guidance of the shepherds, the clerics, the interpreters of the divine word. The picture is straightforward, but false. The shepherds fight with the dogs, because each covets the rights of the other. True, and this is exactly what makes the nature of the flock unsure. Concerned as they are with tearing each other apart reciprocally, dogs and shepherds no longer tend the flock. A part of it is left outside. What do you mean by outside? On the margin. Peasants, only they are not really peasants, because they have no land, or what land they have does not feed them. And citizens, only they are not citizens, because they do not belong to a guild or a corporation. They are the little people, prey of anyone. Have you sometimes seen groups of lepers in the countryside? Yes, once I saw 100 together. Misshapen, their flesh decaying and all whitish, hobbling on their crutches, with swollen eyelids, bleeding eyes. They didn't speak or shout, they twittered, like mice. For the Christian people they are the others, those who remain on the fringe of the flock. The flock hates them, they hate the flock, who wish all lepers like them would die. Yes, I recall a story about King Mark, who had to condemn Isolde the Beautiful and was about to have her ascend the stake when the lepers came and said to the king that the stake was a mild punishment and that there was a worse one. And they cried to him, "Give us Isolde that she may belong to all of us, our illness inflames our desires, give her to your lepers. Look at our rags, glued to our groaning wounds." She, who at your side enjoyed rich stuffs lined with squirrel fur and jewels, when she sees the courtyard of the lepers, when she has to enter our hovels and lie with us, then she will truly recognize her sin and regret this fine pyre of bramble. I see that for a novice of Saint Benedict you have done some odd reading, William remarked. I blushed, because I knew a novice should not read romances, but they circulated among us young people in the Monastery of Melk and we read them at night by candlelight. But that doesn't matter, William continued, you have understood what I meant. The outcast lepers would like to drag everything down in their ruin. And they become all the more evil, the more you cast them out, and the more you depict them as a court of lemures who want your ruin, the more they will be outcast. Saint Francis realized this, and his first decision was to go and live among the lepers. The people of God cannot be changed until the outcasts are restored to its body. But you were speaking of other outcasts, it isn't lepers who form heretical movements. The flock is like a series of circles with one single center, from the broadest range of the flock to its immediate surroundings. The lepers are a sign of exclusion in general. Saint Francis understood that. He didn't want only to help the lepers. If he had, his action would have been reduced to an act of impotent charity. He wanted to say something else. Have you been told about his preaching to the birds? Oh, yes, I've heard that beautiful story, and I admired the saint who enjoyed the company of those tender creatures of God, I said with great fervor. Well, what they told you was mistaken, or, rather, it's a story the order has revised today. When Francis spoke to the people of the city and its magistrates and saw they didn't understand him, he went out to the cemetery and began preaching to ravens and magpies, to hawks, to raptors feeding on corpses. What a horrible thing, I said. Then they were not good birds. They were birds of prey, outcast birds, like the lepers. Francis was surely thinking of that verse of the Apocalypse that says, I saw an angel standing in the sun, and he cried with a loud voice, saying to all the fowls that fly in the midst of heaven, Come and gather yourselves together at the supper of the great God, that ye may eat the flesh of kings, and the flesh of captains, and the flesh of mighty men, and the flesh of horses, and of them that sit on them, and the flesh of all men, both free and bond, both small and great. So Francis wanted to incite the outcasts to revolt. No, that was what Fra Dulcineo and his followers wanted, if anybody did. Francis wanted to call the outcast, ready to revolt, to be part of the people of God. If the flock was to be gathered again, the outcasts had to be found again. Francis didn't succeed, and I say it with great bitterness. To recover the outcasts he had to act within the church. To act within the church he had to obtain the recognition of his rule, from which an order would emerge, and this order, as it emerged, would recompose the image of a circle, at whose margin the outcasts remain. So now do you understand why there are bands of Fraticelli and Joachimites who again gather the outcasts around themselves? But we weren't talking about Francis. We were talking about how heresy is produced by the simple and the outcast. Yes. We were talking about those excluded from the flock of sheep. For centuries, as Pope and Emperor tore each other apart in their quarrels over power, the excluded went on living on the fringe, like lepers, of whom true lepers are only the illustration ordained by God to make us understand this wondrous parable, so that in saying lepers we would understand outcast, poor, simple, excluded, uprooted from the countryside, humiliated in the cities. But we did not understand. The mystery of leprosy has continued to haunt us because we have not recognized the nature of the sign. Excluded as they were from the flock, all of them were ready to hear every sermon that, harking back to the word of Christ, would in effect condemn the behavior of the dogs and shepherds and would promise their punishment one day. The powerful always knew this. Acknowledging the outcasts meant reducing their own privileges, so the outcasts who were acknowledged as outcasts had to be branded as heretics, whatever their doctrine. And for their part, maddened by their exclusion, they were not interested in any doctrine. This is the illusion of heresy. The faith a movement proclaims doesn't count. What counts is the hope it offers. Scratch the heresy and you will find the leper. Every battle against heresy wants only to keep the leper as he is. As for the lepers, what can you ask of them? That they distinguish between two definitions of the Trinity or of the Eucharist. Come, Atso, these games are for us men of learning. The simple have other problems. And mind you, they solve them all in the wrong way. This is why they become heretics. But why do some people support them? Because it serves their purposes, which concern the faith rarely, and more often the conquest of power. Is that why the Church of Rome accuses all its adversaries of heresy? That is why, and that is also why it recognizes as orthodoxy any heresy it can bring back under its own control or must accept because the heresy has become too strong. But there is no precise rule. This holds true also for kings and commoners. Some time ago, in Cremona, the emperor's followers helped the Cathars, but only to embarrass the Church of Rome. Sometimes the city magistrates encourage the heretics only so that they translate the gospel into the vernacular. The vernacular by now is the language of the cities, Latin the language of Rome and the monasteries. And sometimes the magistrates support the world ancients, because they declare that all, men and women, lowly and mighty, can teach and preach, and so they eliminate the distinction that makes clerics irreplaceable. But why, then, do the same city magistrates rebel against the heretics and give the church a powerful hand in having them burned? Because they realize the heretics jeopardize also the privileges of the laity who speak in the vernacular. After Compline, in which they visit the labyrinth again, reach the threshold of the Finus Africae, but cannot enter because they do not know what the first and seventh of the four are, and, finally, Atso has a recurrence, though a very erudite one, of his love malady. The visit to the library cost us long hours of work. Described in words, the verification we aimed to carry out was simple, but our progress by lamplight as we read the legends, marked the passages and the blank walls on the map, recorded the initials, followed the various routes that the play of openings and obstacles allowed us, was very long. And tedious. It was bitter cold. The night was not windy and we did not hear those faint whistlings that had upset us the first evening, but a damp, icy air entered from the arrow slits. We had put on woolen gloves so as to be able to touch the volumes without having our hands become numb. But they were the kind used for writing in winter, the fingertips left bare, and sometimes we had to hold our hands to the flame or put them against our chests or clap them as we hopped about, half frozen. For this reason we didn't perform the whole task consecutively. We stopped to browse in the cases, and now that William, with his new glasses on his nose, could linger and read the books, at every title he discovered he let out exclamations of happiness, either because he knew the work, or because he had been seeking it for a long time, or finally because he had never heard it mentioned and was highly excited and titillated. In short, for him every book was like a fabulous animal that he was meeting in a strange land. And as he leafed through one manuscript, he ordered me to look for others. See what's in that case. And I, deciphering and shifting volumes, said, Historia Anglorum of Bede. And also by Bede, de edification templi, de tabernaculo, de temporibus et computo et chronica et circuli Dionysi, autographia, de ration metrorum, vita sancti Cuthberti, ars metrica. Naturally, the complete works of the Venerable. And look at these. De rhetorica cardination, locorum rhetoricorum distinctio, and here many grammarians, Priscian, Honoratus, Donatus, Maximus, Victorinus, Eutyches, Phocas, Asper. Odd, I thought at first that here there were authors from Anglia. Let us look below. Hesperica Famina. What is that? A Hibernian poem. Listen. Hoc spumens mundanas obvalat pelagus auras. Terrestres amniosis fluctibus cudet margens. Saxiae unducis molibus irut avionias. Infima bomboso vertis misset glarias. Asprifero spurgit spumus sulco. Sonoreus frequenta quotita flabris. I didn't understand the meaning, but as William read he rolled the words in his mouth so that you seemed to hear the sound of the waves and the sea foam. And this. Old Helm of Malmesbury. Listen to this page. Primitus tantorum procerum poematorum pio patissimum paternoque presertum privilegio panegyricum pomatac passim procitori sub polo promulgators. The words all begin with the same letter. The men of my islands are all a bit mad, William said proudly. Let us look in the other case. Virgil. What is he doing here? What Virgil? The Georgics? No. Epitome. I've never heard of it. But it's Virgil of Toulouse, the rhetorician, 6 centuries after the birth of our Lord. He was considered a great sage. Here it says that the arts are Pima, rhetoria, grammar, laporia, dialecta, geometria. But what language was he writing? Latin. A Latin of his own invention, however, which he considered far more beautiful. Read this. He says that astronomy studies the signs of the zodiac, which are Mon, Man, Tont, Piran, Damath, Ophelia, Bogallic, Margaleth, Lutamyron, Tamanon, and Raphalat. Was he crazy? I don't know. He didn't come from my islands. And listen to this. He says there are 12 ways of designating fire. Ignis, Coquohabin, Kirin Copta Cocendi Habit Dictionum, Ardo, Calax ex Calor, Fraganex Frigor Flammi, Russin de Rubor, Fumitin, Eustrax de Urendo, Vicious Ciopin Mortua Membra Suo Vivificat, Ciliulius, Quod de Silla Ciliat, Undit Silex non rex dissita, Nisi ex qua scintilla cilit. And Enian, de Enia Deo, Ciin eo habitat, Siva quo elementis flatus ferta. But there's no one who speaks like that. Happily. But those were times when, to forget an evil world, grammarians took pleasure in abstruse questions. I was told that in that period, for 15 days and 15 nights, the rhetoricians Gabundus and Terentius argued on the vocative of ego, and in the end they attacked each other with weapons. But this, too. Listen. I had grasped a book marvelously illuminated with vegetable labyrinths from which monkeys and serpents peered out. Listen to these words. Cantamen, Colomen, Gondolamen, Stemiamen, Plasmamum, Sonerus, Arboreus, Gordifluus, Glaucomus. My islands, William said again, with tenderness. Don't be too harsh with those monks of far-off Hibernia. Perhaps, if this abbey exists and if we still speak of the Holy Roman Empire, we owe it to them. At that time, the rest of Europe was reduced to a heap of ruins. One day they declared invalid all baptisms imparted by certain priests in Gaul because they baptized in nomine Patris et Filii, and not because they practiced a new heresy and considered Jesus a woman, but because they no longer knew any Latin. Like Salvatore? More or less. Vikings from the far north came down along the rivers to sack Rome. The pagan temples were falling in ruins, and the Christian ones did not yet exist. It was only the monks of Hibernia in their monasteries who wrote and read and wrote, and illuminated, and then jumped into little boats made of animal hide and navigated toward these lands and evangelized them as if you people were infidels, you understand? You have been to Bobbio, which was founded by Saint Columba, one of them. And so never mind if they invented a new Latin, seeing that in Europe no one knew the old Latin anymore. They were great men. Saint Brendan reached the Isles of the Blessed and sailed along the coasts of Hell, where he saw Judas chained to a rock, and one day he landed on an island and went ashore there and found a sea monster. Naturally they were all mad, he repeated contentedly. These images are. I can hardly believe my eyes. So many colors, I said, drinking it all in. From a land that doesn't have many colors, a bit of blue and much green. But we mustn't stand here discussing Hibernian monks. What I want to know is why they are here with the Anglians and with grammarians of other countries. Look at your chart. Where should we be? In the rooms of the West Tower. I've copied down the scrolls, too. So, then, leaving the blind room, we enter the heptagonal room, and there is only one passage to a single room of the tower. The letter in red is H. Then we go from room to room, moving around the tower, and we return to the blind room. The sequence of the letters spells, you are right, Hiberni. Hibernia, if we come from the blind room back into the heptagonal, which, like all the others, has the letter A for apocalypsis. So there are the works of the authors of Ultima Thule, and also the grammarians and rhetoricians, because the men who arranged the library thought that a grammarian should remain with the Hibernian grammarians, even if he came from Toulouse. It is a criterion. You see, we are beginning to understand something. But in the rooms of the East Tower, where we came in, we read FONS. What does that mean? Read your map carefully. Keep reading the letters of the rooms that follow, in order of access. Fons adieu. No, Fons adieu. The U is the second East blind room, I remember it. Perhaps it fits into another sequence. And what did we find in the Fons adieu, that is, in the earthly paradise? Remember that the room with the altar facing the rising sun is there. There were many Bibles there, and commentaries on the Bible, only books of Holy Scripture. And so, you see, the word of God corresponding to the earthly paradise, which as all say is far off to the east. And here, to the west, Hibernia. So the plan of the library, Vespers, in which Ubertino takes flight, Benno begins to observe the laws, and William makes some reflections on the various types of lust encountered that day. As the monks slowly emerged from the chapter house, Michael came over to William, and then both of them were joined by Ubertino. Together we all went out into the open, to confer in the cloister under cover of the fog, which showed no sign of thinning out. Indeed, it was made even thicker by the shadows. Bernard has defeated us. Don't ask me whether that imbecile Dulcinea is really guilty of all those crimes. As far as I can tell, he isn't, not at all. The fact is, we are back where we started. John wants you alone in Avignon, Michael, and this meeting hasn't given you the guarantees we were looking for. On the contrary, it has given you an idea of how every word of yours, up there, could be distorted. Whence we must deduce, it seems to me, that you should not go. Michael shook his head. I will go, on the contrary. I do not want a schism. You, William, spoke very clearly today, and you said what you would like. Well, that is not what I want, and I realize that the decisions of the Perugia chapter have been used by the imperial theologians beyond our intentions. I want the Franciscan order to be accepted by the Pope with its ideal of poverty, and the Pope must understand that unless the order confirms the ideal of poverty, it will never be possible for it to recover the heretical offshoots. I will go to Avignon, and if necessary I will make an act of submission to John. I will compromise on everything except the principle of poverty. Ubertino spoke up. You know you are risking your life. So be it, Michael answered. Better than risking my soul. He did seriously risk his life, and if John was right, as I still do not believe, Michael also lost his soul. As everyone knows by now, Michael went to the Pope a week after the events I am narrating. He held out against him for 4 months, until in April of the following year John convened a consistory in which he called Michael a madman, a reckless, stubborn, tyrannical fomenter of heresy, a viper nourished in the very bosom of the church. And one might think that, according to his way of seeing things, John was right, because during those 4 months Michael had become a friend of my master's friend, the other William, the one from Ockham, and had come to share his ideas, more extreme, but not very different from those my master shared with Marsilius and had expounded that morning. The life of these dissidents became precarious in Avignon, and at the end of May, Michael, William of Ockham, Bonagracia of Bergamo, Francis of Ascoli, and Henri de Talheim took flight, pursued by the Pope's men to Nice, then Toulon, Marseilles, and Aigues-Mortes, where they were overtaken by Cardinal Pierre de Arablé, who tried to persuade them to go back but was unable to overcome their resistance, their hatred of the pontiff, their fear. In June they reached Pisa, where they were received in triumph by the imperial forces, and in the following months Michael was to denounce John publicly. Too late. By then, the emperor's fortunes were ebbing. From Avignon John was plotting to give the Minorites a new superior general, and he finally achieved victory. Michael would have done better not to decide that day to go to the Pope. He could have led the Minorites' resistance more closely, without wasting so many months in his enemy's power, weakening his own position. But perhaps divine omnipotence had so ordained things, nor do I know now who among them all was in the right. After so many years even the fire of passion dies, and with it what was believed the light of the truth. But I am straying into melancholy digressions. I must tell instead of the end of that sad conversation. Michael had made up his mind, and there was no way of convincing him to desist. But another problem arose, and William announced it without mincing words. Ubertino himself was no longer safe. The words Bernard had addressed to him, the hatred the Pope now felt toward him, The fact that, whereas Michael still represented a power with which to negotiate, Ubertino was a party unto himself at this point. John wants Michael at court and Ubertino in hell. If I know Bernard, before tomorrow is over, with the complicity of the fog, Ubertino will be killed. And if anyone asks who did it, the Abbey can easily bear another crime, and they will say it was done by devils summoned by Remigio and his black cats, or by some surviving Dulcinians still lurking inside these walls. Ubertino was worried. Then, he asked. Then, William said, go and speak with the abbot. Ask him for a mount, some provisions, and a letter to some distant abbey, beyond the Alps. And take advantage of the darkness and the fog to leave at once. But are the archers not still guarding the gates? The abbey has other exits, and the abbot knows them. A servant has only to be waiting for you at one of the lower curves with a horse, and after slipping through some passage in the walls, you will have only to go through a stretch of woods. You must act immediately, before Bernard recovers from the ecstasy of his triumph. I must concern myself with something else. I had 2 missions. One has failed, at least the other must succeed. I want to get my hands on a book, and on a man. If all goes well, you will be out of here before I seek you again. So farewell, then. He opened his arms. Moved, Ubertino held him in a close embrace. Farewell, William. You are a mad and arrogant Englishman, but you have a great heart. Will we meet again? We will meet again, William assured him. God will wish it. God, however, did not wish it. As I have already said, Ubertino died, mysteriously killed, 2 years later. A hard and adventurous life, the life of this mettlesome and ardent old man. Perhaps he was not a saint, but I hope God rewarded his adamantine certainty of being one. The older I grow and the more I abandon myself to God's will, the less I value intelligence that wants to know and will that wants to do, and as the only element of salvation I recognize faith, which can wait patiently, without asking too many questions. And Ubertino surely had great faith in the blood and agony of our Lord crucified. Perhaps I was thinking these things even then, and the old mystic realized it, or guessed that I would think them one day. He smiled at me sweetly and embraced me, without the intensity with which he had sometimes gripped me in the preceding days. He embraced me as a grandfather embraces his grandson, and in the same spirit I returned the embrace. Then he went off with Michael to seek the abbot. And now? I asked William. And now, back to our crimes. Master, I said, today many things happened, grave things for Christianity, and our mission has failed. And yet you seem more interested in solving this mystery than in the conflict between the Pope and the Emperor. Madmen and children always speak the truth, Azzo. It may be that, as imperial advisor, my friend Marsilius is better than I, but as inquisitor I am better. Even better than Bernard Gui, God forgive me. Because Bernard is interested, not in discovering the guilty, but in burning the accused. And I, on the contrary, find the most joyful delight in unraveling a nice, complicated knot. And it must also be because, at a time when as philosopher I doubt the world has an order, I am consoled to discover, if not an order, at least a series of connections in small areas of the world's affairs. Finally, there is probably another reason. In this story things greater and more important than the battle between John and Louis may be at stake. But it is a story of theft and vengeance among monks of scant virtue, I cried, dubiously. Because of a forbidden book, Azzo. A forbidden book. William replied. By now the monks were heading for supper. Our meal was half over when Michael of Cesena sat down beside us and told us Ubertino had left. William heaved a sigh of relief. At the end of the meal, we avoided the abbot, who was conversing with Bernard, and noted Benno, who greeted us with a half smile as he tried to gain the door. William overtook him and forced him to follow us to a corner of the kitchen. Benno, William asked him, where is the book? What book? Benno, neither of us is a fool. I am speaking of the book we were hunting for today in Severanus's laboratory, which I did not recognize. But you recognized it very well and went back to get it. What makes you think I took it? I think you did, and you think the same. Where is it? I cannot tell. Benno, if you refuse to tell me, I will speak with the abbot. I cannot tell by order of the abbot, Benno said, with a virtuous air. Today, after we saw each other, something happened that you should know about. On Berengar's death there was no assistant librarian. This afternoon Malachi proposed me for the position. Just half an hour ago the abbot agreed, and tomorrow morning, I hope, I will be initiated into the secrets of the library. True, I did take the book this morning, and I hid it in the pallet in my cell without even looking at it, because I knew Malachi was keeping an eye on me. Eventually Malachi made me the proposal I told you. And then I did what an assistant librarian must do. I handed the book over to him. I could not refrain from speaking out, and violently. But, Benno, yesterday and the day before you said you were burning with the curiosity to know. You didn't want the library to conceal mysteries any longer. You said a scholar must know. Benno was silent, blushing. But William stopped me. Azzo, a few hours ago Benno joined the other side. Now he is the guardian of those secrets he wanted to know. and while he guards them he will have all the time he wants to learn them. But the others? I asked. Benno was speaking also in the name of all men of learning. Before, William said. And he drew me away, leaving Benno the prey of confusion. Benno, William then said to me, is the victim of a great lust, which is not that of Berengar or that of the cellarer. Like many scholars, he has a lust for knowledge. Knowledge for its own sake. Barred from a part of this knowledge, he wanted to seize it. Now he has it. Malachi knew his man. He used the best means to recover the book and seal Benno's lips. You will ask me what is the good of controlling such a hoard of learning if one has agreed not to put it at the disposal of everyone else. But this is exactly why I speak of lust. Roger Bacon's thirst for knowledge was not lust. He wanted to employ his learning to make God's people happier, and so he did not seek knowledge for its own sake. Benno's is merely insatiable curiosity, intellectual pride, another way for a monk to transform and allay the desires of his loins, or the order that makes another man a warrior of the faith or of heresy. There is lust not only of the flesh. Bernard Gouy is lustful. His is a distorted lust for justice that becomes identified with a lust for power. Our holy and no longer Roman pontiff lusts for riches. And the cellarer as a youth had a lust to testify and transform and do penance, and then a lust for death. And Benno's lust is for books. Like all lusts, including that of Onan, who spilled his seed on the ground, it is sterile and has nothing to do with love, not even carnal love. I know, I murmured, despite myself. William pretended not to hear. Continuing his observations, he said, true love wants the good of the beloved. Can it be that Benno wants the good of his books, and now they are also his, and thinks their good lies in their being kept far from grasping hands? I asked. The good of a book lies in its being read. A book is made up of signs that speak of other signs, which in their turn speak of things. Without an eye to read them, a book contains signs that produce no concepts, therefore it is dumb. This library was perhaps born to save the books it houses, but now it lives to bury them. This is why it has become a sink of iniquity. The cellarer says he betrayed. So has Benno. He has betrayed. Oh, what a nasty day, my good Adso. Full of blood and ruination. I have had enough of this day. Let us also go to Carmpline, and then to bed. Coming out of the kitchen, we encountered Imaro. He asked us whether the rumor going around was true, that Malachi had proposed Benno as his assistant. We could only confirm it. Our Malachi has accomplished many fine things today, Imaro said, with his usual sneer of contempt and indulgence. If justice existed, the devil would come and take him this very night. Prime. In which Nicholas tells many things as the crypt of the treasure is visited. Nicholas of Moromondo, in his new position as cellarer, was giving orders to the cooks, and they were supplying him with information about the operation of the kitchen. William wanted to speak with him, but Nicholas asked us to wait a few moments, until he had to go down into the crypt of the treasure to supervise the polishing of the glass cases, which was still his responsibility. There he would have more time for conversation. A little later, he did in fact ask us to follow him. He entered the church, went behind the main altar, while the monks were setting up a catafalque in the nave, to keep vigil over Malachi's corpse, and led us down a little ladder. At its foot we found ourselves in a room with a very low vaulted ceiling supported by thick rough stone columns. We were in the crypt where the riches of the abbey were stored, a place of which the abbot was very jealous and which he allowed to be opened only under exceptional circumstances and for very important visitors. On every side were cases of different dimensions. In them, objects of wondrous beauty shone in the glow of the torches, lighted by two of Nicholas's trusted assistants. Gold vestments, golden crowns studded with gems, coffers of various metals engraved with figures, works in yellow and ivory. In ecstasy, Nicholas showed us an evangeliarium whose binding displayed amazing enamel plaques composing a variegated unity of graduated compartments, outlined in gold filigree and fixed by precious stones in the guise of nails. He showed us a delicate edicula with 2 columns of lapis lazuli and gold which framed an entombment of Christ in fine silver bas-relief surmounted by a golden cross set with 13 diamonds against a background of brainy onyx, while the little pediment was scalloped with agate and rubies. Then I saw a chryselephantine diptych divided into 5 sections, with 5 scenes from the life of Christ, and in the center a mystical lamp composed of cells of gilded silver with glass paste, a single polychrome image on a ground of wax and whiteness. Nicholas's face and gestures, as he illustrated these things for us, were radiant with pride. William praised the objects he had seen, then asked Nicholas what sort of man Malachi had been. Nicholas moistened one finger and rubbed it over a crystal surface imperfectly polished, then answered with a half smile, not looking William in the face. As many said, Malachi seemed quite thoughtful, but on the contrary he was a very simple man. According to Alenado, he was a fool. Alenado bears a grudge against someone for a remote event, when he was denied the honor of being librarian. I, too, have heard talk of that, but it is an old story, dating back at least 50 years. When I arrived here the librarian was Robert of Bobbio, and the old monks muttered about an injustice committed against Alenado. Robert had an assistant, who later died, and Malachi, still very young, was appointed in his place. Many said that Malachi was without merit, that though he claimed to know Greek and Arabic it was not true, he was only good at aping, copying manuscripts in those languages in fine calligraphy, without understanding what he was copying. Alenardo insinuated that Malachi had been put in that position to favor the schemes of his, Alenardo's, enemy. But I did not understand whom he meant. That is the whole story. There have always been whispers that Malachi protected the library like a guard dog, but with no knowledge of what he was guarding. For that matter, there was also whispering against Berengar, when Malachi chose him as assistant. They said that the young man was no cleverer than his master, that he was only an intriguer. They also said, but you must have heard these rumors yourself by now, that there was a strange relationship between him and Malachi. Old gossip. Then, as you know, there was talk about Berengar and Adelmo, and the young scribe said that Malachi silently suffered horrible jealousy. And then there was also murmuring about the ties between Malachi and Jorge. No, not in the sense you might believe, no one has ever murmured against Jorge's virtue, but Malachi, as librarian, by tradition should have chosen the abbot as his confessor, whereas all the other monks go to Jorge for confession, or to Alenardo, but the old man is by now almost mindless. Well, they said that in spite of this, the librarian conferred too often with Jorge, as if the abbot directed Malachi's soul but Jorge ruled his body, his actions, his work. Indeed, as you know yourself and have probably seen, if anyone wanted to know the location of an ancient, forgotten book, he did not ask Malachi, but Jorge. Malachi kept the catalogue and went up into the library, but Jorge knew what each title meant. Why did Jorge know so many things about the library? He is the oldest, after Alenardo. He has been here since his youth. Jorge must be over 80, and they say he has been blind at least 40 years, perhaps longer. How did he become so learned, before his blindness? Oh, there are legends about him. It seems that when he was only a boy he was already blessed by divine grace, and in his native Castile he read the books of the Arabs and the Greek doctors while still a child. And then even after his blindness, even now, he sits for long hours in the library, he has others recite the catalogue to him and bring him books, and a novice reads aloud to him for hours and hours. Now that Malachi and Berengar are dead, who is left who possesses the secrets of the library? The abbot, and the abbot must now hand them on to Benno if he chooses. Why do you say if he chooses? Because Benno is young, and he was named assistant while Malachi was still alive. Being assistant librarian is different from being librarian. By tradition, the librarian later becomes abbot. Ah, so that is it. That is why the post of librarian is so coveted. But then Abbo was once librarian? No, not Abbo. His appointment took place before I arrived here. It must be 30 years ago now. Before that, Paul of Rimini was abbot, a curious man about whom they tell strange stories. It seems he was a most voracious reader, he knew by heart all the books in the library, but he had a strange infirmity, he was unable to write. They called him Abbas Agraphicus. He became abbot when very young. It was said he had the support of Algerdas of Cluny. But this is old monkish gossip. Anyway, Paul became abbot, and Robert of Bobbio took his place in the library, but he wasted away as an illness consumed him. They knew he would never be able to govern the abbey, and when Paul of Rimini disappeared, he died. No, he disappeared, I do not know how. One day he went off on a journey and never came back. Perhaps he was killed by thieves in the course of his travels. Anyway, when Paul disappeared, Robert could not take his place, and there were obscure plots. Abbo, it is said, was the natural son of the lord of this district. He grew up in the abbey of Fossanova. It was said that as a youth he attended St. Thomas when he died there and had been in charge of carrying that great body down the stairs of a tower where the corpse could not pass. That was his moment of glory, the malicious here murmured. The fact is, he was elected abbot, even though he had not been librarian, and he was instructed by someone, Robert I believe, in the mysteries of the library. Now you understand why I do not know whether the abbot will want to instruct Benno. It would be like naming him his successor, a heedless youth, a half-barbarian grammarian from the far north. What could he know about this country, the abbey, its relations with the lords of the area? But Malachi was not Italian, either, or Berengar, and yet both of them were appointed to the library. There is a mysterious thing for you. The monks grumble that for the past half-century or more the abbey has been forsaking its traditions. This is why, over 50 years ago, perhaps earlier, Alenardo aspired to the position of librarian. The librarian had always been Italian, there is no scarcity of great minds in this land. And besides, you see, here Nicholas hesitated, as if reluctant to say what he was about to say. You see, Malachi and Berengar died, perhaps so that they would not become abbot. He stirred, waved his hand before his face as if to dispel thoughts less than honest, then made the sign of the cross. Whatever am I saying? You see, in this country shameful things have been happening for many years, even in the monasteries, in the papal court, in the churches. Conflicts to gain power, accusations of heresy to take a prebend from someone. How ugly. I am losing faith in the human race. I see plots and palace conspiracies on every side. That our abbey should come to this, a nest of vipers risen through occult magic in what had been a triumph of sainted members. Look, the past of this monastery. He pointed to the treasures scattered all around, and, leaving the crosses and other vessels, he took us to see the reliquaries, which represented the glory of this place. Look, he said, this is the tip of the spear that pierced the side of the Savior. We saw a golden box with a crystal lid, containing a purple cushion on which lay a piece of iron, triangular in shape, once corroded by rust but now restored to vivid splendor by long application of oils and waxes. But this was still nothing. For in another box, of silver studded with amethysts, its front panel transparent, I saw a piece of the venerated wood of the Holy Cross, brought to this abbey by Queen Helena herself, mother of the Emperor Constantine, after she had gone as a pilgrim to the holy places, excavated the hill of Golgotha and the Holy Sepulchre, and constructed a cathedral over it. Then Nicholas showed us other things, and I could not describe them all, in their number and their rarity. There was, in a case of aquamarine, a nail of the cross. In an ampoule, lying on a cushion of little withered roses, there was a portion of the crown of thorns, and in another box, again on a blanket of dried flowers, a yellowed shred of the tablecloth from the Last Supper. And then there was the purse of Saint Matthew, of silver links, and in a cylinder, bound by a violet ribbon eaten by time and sealed with gold, a bone from Saint Anne's arm. I saw, wonder of wonders, under a glass bell, on a red cushion embroidered with pearls, a piece of the manger of Bethlehem, and a hand's length of the purple tunic of Saint John the Evangelist, 2 lengths of the chains that bound the ankles of the Apostle Peter in Rome, the skull of Saint Adalbert, the sword of Saint Stephen, a tibia of Saint Margaret, a finger of Saint Vitalis, a rib of Saint Sophia, the chin of Saint Eobanus, the upper part of Saint Chrysostom's shoulder blade, the engagement ring of Saint Joseph, a tooth of the Baptist, Moses' rod, a tattered scrap of very fine lace from the Virgin Mary's wedding dress. And then other things that were not relics but still bore perennial witness to wonders and wondrous beings from distant lands, brought to the abbey by monks who had traveled to the farthest ends of the world. A stuffed basilisk and hydra, a unicorn's horn, an egg that a hermit had found inside another egg, a piece of the manna that had fed the Hebrews in the desert, a whale's tooth, a coconut, the scapula of an animal from before the flood, an elephant's ivory tusk, the rib of a dolphin. And then more relics that I did not identify, whose reliquaries were perhaps more precious than they, and some, judging by the craftsmanship of their containers, of black and silver, very ancient. An endless series of fragments, bone, cloth, wood, metal, glass, and phials with dark powders, one of which, I learned, contained the charred remains of the city of Sodom, and another some mortar from the walls of Jericho. All things, even the humblest, for which an emperor would have given more than a castle, and which represented a hoard not only of immense prestige but also of actual material wealth for the abbey that preserved them. I continued wandering about, dumbfounded, for Nicholas had now stopped explaining the objects, each of which was described by a scroll anyway, and now I was free to roam virtually at random amid that display of priceless wonders, at times admiring things in full light, at times glimpsing them in semi-darkness, as Nicholas's helpers moved to another part of the crypt with their torches. I was fascinated by those yellowed bits of cartilage, mystical and revolting at the same time, transparent and mysterious, by those shreds of clothing from some immemorial age, faded, threadbare, sometimes rolled up in a file like a faded manuscript, by those crumbled materials mingling with the fabric that was their bed, holy jetsam of a life once animal, and rational, and now, imprisoned in constructions of crystal or of metal that in their minuscule size mined the boldness of stone. Cathedrals with towers and turrets, all seemed transformed into mineral substance as well. Is this, then, how the bodies of the saints, buried, await the resurrection of the flesh? From these shards would there be reconstructed those organisms that in the splendor of the beatific vision, regaining their every natural sensitivity, would sense, as Pipernus wrote, even the minimus differentias odorum? William stirred me from my meditations as he touched my shoulder. I am going, he said. I am going up to the scriptorium. I have yet something to consult. But it will be impossible to have any books, I said. Benno was given orders. I have to re-examine only the books I was reading the other day. All are still in the scriptorium, on Venantius's desk. You stay here, if you like. This crypt is a beautiful epitome of the debates on poverty you have been following these past few days. And now you know why your brothers make mincemeat of one another as they aspire to the position of abbot. But do you believe what Nicholas implied? Are the crimes connected with a conflict over the investiture? I've already told you that for the present I don't want to put hypotheses into words. Nicholas said many things, and some interested me. But now I am going to follow yet another trail. Or perhaps the same, but from a different direction. And don't succumb too much to the spell of these cases. I have seen many other fragments of the cross, in other churches. If all were genuine, our Lord's torment could not have been on a couple of planks nailed together, but on an entire forest. Master, I said, shocked. So it is, Azzo. And there are even richer treasuries. Some time ago, in a German cathedral, I saw the skull of John the Baptist at the age of 12. Really? I exclaimed, amazed. Then, seized by doubt, I added, but the Baptist was executed at a more advanced age. The other skull must be in another treasury, William said, with a grave face. I never understood when he was jesting. In my country, when you joke you say something and then you laugh very noisily, so everyone shares in the joke. But William laughed only when he said serious things, and remained very serious when he was presumably joking. Gnomes. In which the abbot refuses to listen to William, discourses on the language of gems, and expresses a wish that there be no further investigation of the recent unhappy events. The abbot's apartments were over the chapter hall, and from the window of the large and sumptuous main room, where he received us, you could see, on that clear and windy day, beyond the roof of the abbatial church, the massive edificium. The abbot, standing at the window, was in fact contemplating it, and he pointed it out to us with a solemn gesture. An admirable fortress, he said, whose proportions sum up the golden rule that governed the construction of the ark. Divided into 3 stories, because 3 is the number of the Trinity, 3 were the angels who visited Abraham, the days Jonah spent in the belly of the great fish, and the days Jesus and Lazarus passed in the sepulchre. 3 times Christ asked the Father to let the bitter chalice pass from him, and 3 times he hid himself to pray with the apostles. 3 times Peter denied him, and 3 times Christ appeared to his disciples after the resurrection. The theological virtues are 3, and 3 are the holy languages, the parts of the soul, the classes of intellectual creatures, angels, men, and devils. There are 3 kinds of sound: vox, flatus, pulsus, and 3 epochs of human history, before, during, and after the law. A wondrous harmony of mystical relations, William agreed. But the square shape also, the abbot continued, is rich in spiritual lessons. The cardinal points are 4, and the seasons, the elements, and heat, cold, wet, and dry, birth, growth, maturity, and old age, the species of animals, celestial, terrestrial, aerial, and aquatic, the colors forming the rainbow, and the number of years required to make a leap year. Oh, to be sure, William said, and 3 plus 4 is 7, a superlatively mystical number, whereas 3 multiplied by 4 makes 12, like the apostles, and 12 by 12 makes 144, which is the number of the elect. And to this last display of mystical knowledge of the ideal world of numbers, the abbot had nothing further to add. Thus William could come to the point. We must talk about the latest events, on which I have reflected at length, he said. The abbot turned his back to the window and looked straight at William with a stern face. At too great length, perhaps. I must confess, brother William, that I expected more of you. Almost 6 days have passed since you arrived here. 4 months have died besides Adelmo. 2 have been arrested by the Inquisition. It was justice, to be sure, but we could have avoided this shame if the Inquisitor had not been obliged to concern himself with the previous crimes. And finally the meeting over which I presided has, precisely because of all these wicked deeds, had a pitiful outcome. William remained silent, embarrassed. Without question, the abbot was right. That is true, he admitted. I have not lived up to your expectations, but I will explain why, your sublimity. These crimes do not stem from a brawl or from some vendetta among the monks, but from deeds that, in their turn, originate in the remote history of the abbey. The abbot looked at him uneasily. What do you mean? I myself realize that the key is not that miserable affair of the cellarer, which has intercepted another story, but the other, that other which I may know but cannot discuss. I hoped it was clear, and that you would speak to me about it. Your sublimity is thinking of some deed he learned about in confession. The abbot looked away, and William continued, if your magnificence wants to know whether I know, without having learned it from your magnificence, that there were illicit relations between Berengar and Adelmo, and between Berengar and Malachi, well, yes, everyone in the abbey knows this. The abbot blushed violently. I do not believe it useful to speak of such things in the presence of this novice. And I do not believe, now that the meeting is over, that you need him any longer as scribe. Go, boy, he said to me imperiously. Humiliated, I went. But in my curiosity I crouched outside the door of the hall, which I left ajar, so that I could follow the dialogue. William resumed speaking. So, then, these illicit relations, if they did take place, had scant influence on the painful events. The key is elsewhere, as I thought you imagined. Everything turns on the theft and possession of a book, which was concealed in the finest Afrique, and which is now there again thanks to Malachi's intervention, though, as you have seen, the sequence of crimes was not thereby arrested. A long silence followed. Then the abbot resumed speaking, in a broken, hesitant voice, like someone taken aback by unexpected revelations. This is impossible, you. How do you know about the finest Afrique? Have you violated my ban and entered the library? William ought to have told the truth, but the abbot's rage would have known no bounds. Yet, obviously my master did not want to lie. He chose to answer the question with another question. Did your magnificence not say to me, at our first meeting, that a man like me, who had described Brunellus so well without ever having seen him, would have no difficulty picturing places to which he did not have access? So that is it, Abbo said. But why do you think what you think? How I arrived at my conclusion is too long a story. But a series of crimes was committed to prevent many from discovering something that it was considered undesirable for them to discover. Now all those who knew something of the library's secrets, whether rightly or through trickery, are dead. Only one person remains, Yourself. Do you wish to insinuate? You wish to insinuate, the abbot said. Do not misunderstand me, said William, who probably had indeed wished to insinuate. I say there is someone who knows and wants no one else to know. As the last to know, you could be the next victim. Unless you tell me what you know about that forbidden book, and, especially, who in the abbey might know what you know, and perhaps more, about the library. It is cold in here, the abbot said. Let us go out. I moved rapidly away from the door and waited for them at the head of the stairs. The abbot saw me and smiled at me. How many upsetting things this young monk must have heard in the past few days. Come, boy, do not allow yourself to be too distressed. It seems to me that more plots have been imagined than really exist. He raised one hand and allowed the daylight to illuminate a splendid ring he wore on his fourth finger, the emblem of his power. The ring sparkled with all the brilliance of its stones. You recognize it, do you not? He said to me. The symbol of my authority, but also of my burden. It is not an ornament, it is a splendid syllogy of the divine word whose guardian I am. With his fingers he touched the stone, or, rather, the arrangement of variegated stones composing that admirable masterpiece of human art and nature. This is amethyst, he said, which is the mirror of humility and reminds us of the ingenuousness and sweetness of Saint Matthew. This is chalcedony, mark of charity, symbol of the piety of Joseph and Saint James the Greater. This is jasper, which bespeaks faith and is associated with Saint Peter, and sardonyx, sign of martyrdom, which recalls Saint Bartholomew. This is sapphire, hope and contemplation, the stone of Saint Andrew and Saint Paul, and beryl, sound doctrine, learning, and longanimity, the virtues of Saint Thomas. How splendid the language of gems is, he went on, lost in his mystical vision, which the lapidaries of tradition have translated from the reasoning of Aaron and the description of the heavenly Jerusalem in the book of the Apostle. For that matter, the walls of Zion were decked with the same jewels that decorated the pectoral of Moses' brother, except for carbuncle, agate, and onyx, which, mentioned in Exodus, are replaced in the Apocalypse by chalcedony, sardonyx, chrysoprase, and jacinth. He moved the ring and dazzled my eyes with its sparkling, as if he wanted to stun me. Marvelous language, is it not? 4 other fathers' stones signify still other things. For Pope Innocent III the ruby announced calm and patience, the garnet, charity. The language of gems is multiform, each expresses several truths, according to the context in which they appear. And who decides what is the proper context? You know, my boy, for they have taught you, it is authority, the most reliable commentator of all and the most invested with prestige, and therefore with sanctity. Otherwise, how to avoid the misunderstandings into which the devil lures us? It is extraordinary how the devil hates the language of gems. The foul beast sees in it a message illuminated by different levels of knowledge, and he would like to destroy it because he senses in the splendor of stones the echo of the marvels in his possession before his fall. He held out the ring for me to kiss, and I knelt. He stroked my head. And so, boy, you must forget the things, no doubt erroneous, that you have heard these days. You have entered the noblest, the greatest order of all. Of this order I am an abbot, and you are under my jurisdiction. Hear my command, forget, and may your lips be sealed forever. Swear. Moved, subjugated, I would certainly have sworn. And you, my good reader, would not be able now to read this faithful chronicle of mine. But at this point William intervened, not perhaps to prevent me from swearing, but in an instinctive reaction, out of irritation, to break that spell the abbot had surely cast. What does the boy have to do with it? I asked you a question, I warned you of a danger, I asked you to tell me a name. Do you now wish me, too, to kiss the ring and swear to forget what I have learned or what I suspect? Ah, you, the abbot said sadly, I do not expect a mendicant friar to understand the beauty of our traditions, or respect the reticence and the vow of silence on which our greatness is based. You have spoken to me of a strange story, an incredible story, about a banned book that has caused a chain of murders, about someone who knows what only I should know. Tales, meaningless accusations. Speak of it, if you wish. No one will believe you. And even if some element of your fanciful reconstruction were true, well, now everything is once more under my control, my jurisdiction. I will look into this. I have the means. I have the authority. At the very beginning I made a mistake, asking an outsider, however wise, to investigate things that are my responsibility alone. But you understood. I believed at the outset that it involved a violation of the vow of chastity, and I wanted someone else to tell me what I had heard in confession. Well, now you have told me. The meeting of the legations has taken place. Your mission is over. I imagine you are anxiously awaited at the imperial court. One does not deprive oneself at length of a man like you. I give you permission to leave the abbey. I do not want you to travel after sunset, for the roads are not safe. You will leave tomorrow morning, early. Oh, do not thank me. It has been a joy to have you here, a brother among brothers, honoring you with our hospitality. You may withdraw now with your novice to prepare your baggage. Naturally, it is not necessary for you to continue your investigations. Do not disturb the monks further. You may go. It was more than a dismissal, it was an expulsion. William said goodbye and we went down the stairs. What does this mean? I asked. I no longer understood anything. Try to formulate a hypothesis. You must have learned how it is done. Actually, I have learned I must formulate at least two, one in opposition to the other, and both incredible. Very well, then I gulped. Formulating hypotheses made me nervous. First hypothesis. The abbot knew everything already and imagined you would discover nothing. Second hypothesis. The abbot never suspected anything about what I don't know, because I don't know what's in your mind. But, anyhow, he went on thinking it was all because of a quarrel between sodomite monks. Now, however, you have opened his eyes, he has suddenly understood something terrible, has thought of a name, has a precise idea about who is responsible for the crimes. But at this point he wants to resolve the matter by himself and wants to be rid of you, in order to save the honor of the abbey. Good work. You are beginning to reason well. But you see already that in both cases our abbot is concerned for the good name of his monastery. Murderer or next victim as he may be, he does not want defamatory news about this holy community to travel beyond these mountains. Kill his monks, but do not touch the honor of his abbey. William was now becoming infuriated. That bastard of a feudal lord, that peacock who gained fame for having been the Aquinas' gravedigger, that inflated wineskin who exists only because he wears a ring as big as the bottom of a glass. Proud, all of you Cluniacs, worse than princes, more baronial than barons. Master, I ventured, hurt, in a reproachful tone. You be quiet, you are made of the same stuff. Your band are not simple men, or sons of the simple. If a peasant comes along you may receive him, but as I saw yesterday, you do not hesitate to hand him over to the secular arm. But not one of your own, no, he must be shielded. Abbo is capable of identifying the wretch, stabbing him in the treasure crypt, and passing out his kidneys among the reliquaries, provided the honor of the abbey is saved. Have a Franciscan, a plebeian minorite, discover the rat's nest of this holy house? No, this is something Abbo cannot allow at any price. Thank you, Brother William, the Emperor needs you. You see what a beautiful ring I have, goodbye. But now the challenge is not just a matter between me and Abbo, it is between me and the whole business. I am not leaving these walls until I have found out. He wants me to leave tomorrow morning, does he? Very well, it's his house, but by tomorrow morning I must know. I must. You must. Who obliges you now? No one ever obliges us to know, Adso. We must, that is all, even if we comprehend imperfectly. I was still confused and humiliated by William's words against my order and its abbots. And I tried to justify Abbo in part, formulating a third hypothesis, exercising a skill at which, it seemed to me, I was becoming very dexterous. You have not considered a third possibility, Master, I said. We had noticed these past days, and this morning it seemed quite clear to us after Nicholas's confidences and the rumors we heard in church, that there is a group of Italian monks reluctant to tolerate the succession of foreign librarians. They accuse the abbot of not respecting tradition, and, as I understand it, they hide behind old Alenardo, thrusting him forward like a standard, to ask for a different government of the abbey. So perhaps the abbot fears our revelations could give his enemies a weapon, and he wants to settle the question with great prudence. That is possible. But he is still an inflated wineskin, and he will get himself killed. We were in the cloister. The wind was growing angrier all the time, the light dimmer, even if it was just past nones. The day was approaching its sunset, and we had very little time left. It is late, William said, and when a man has little time, he must take care to maintain his calm. We must act as if we had eternity before us. I have a problem to solve, how to penetrate the finest Africi, because the final answer must be there. Then we must save some person, I have not yet determined which. Finally, we should expect something from the direction of the stables, which you will keep an eye on. Look at all the bustle. In fact, the space between the edificium and the cloister was unusually animated. A moment before, a novice, coming from the abbot's house, had run toward the edificium. Now Nicholas was coming out of it, heading for the dormitories. In one corner, that morning's group, Pacificus, Aimaro, and Peter, were deep in discussion with Alenardo, as if trying to convince him of something. Then they seemed to reach a decision. Aimaro supported the still reluctant Alenardo, and went with him toward the abbatial residence. They were just entering as Nicholas came out of the dormitory, leading Jorge in the same direction. Seeing the two Italians enter, he whispered something into Jorge's ear, and the old man shook his head. They continued, however, toward the chapter house. The abbot is taking the situation in hand, William murmured skeptically. From the edificium were emerging more monks, who belonged in the scriptorium, and they were immediately followed by Benno, who came toward us, more worried than ever. There is unrest in the scriptorium, he told us. Nobody is working, they are all talking among themselves. What is happening? What's happening is that the people who until this morning seemed the most suspect are all dead. Until yesterday everyone was on guard against Berengar, foolish and treacherous and lascivious, then the Cellarer, a suspect heretic, and finally Malachi, so disliked by everyone. Now they don't know whom to be on guard against, and they urgently need to find an enemy, or a scapegoat. And each suspects the others. Some are afraid, like you. Others have decided to frighten someone else. You are all too agitated. Atso, take a look at the stables every now and then. I am going to get some rest. I should have been amazed. To go and rest when he had only a few hours left did not seem the wisest decision. But by now I knew my master. The more relaxed his body, the more ebullient his mind. After calmed line, in which, almost by chance, William discovers the secret of entering the finest Africa. Like a pair of assassins, we lurked near the entrance, behind a column, whence we could observe the chapel with the skulls. Abbo has gone to close the edificium, William said. When he has barred the doors from the inside, he can only come out through the assarium. And then we will see what he does. We did not discover what he did. An hour went by and he still had not reappeared. He's gone into the finest Africa, I said. Perhaps, William answered. Eager to formulate more hypotheses, I added, perhaps he came out again through the refectory and has gone to look for Jorge. And William answered, that is also possible. Perhaps Jorge is already dead, I imagined further. Perhaps he is in the edificium and is killing the abbot. Perhaps they are both in some other place and some other person is lying in wait for them. What did the Italians want? And why was Benno so frightened? Was it perhaps only a mask he had assumed, to mislead us? Why had he lingered in the scriptorium during Vespers, if he didn't know how to close the scriptorium or how to get out? Did he want to essay the passages of the labyrinth? All is possible, William said. But only one thing is happening, or has happened, or is about to happen. And at last divine providence is offering us a radiant certitude. What is that? I asked, full of hope. That brother William of Baskerville, who now has the impression of having understood everything, does not know how to enter the finest Africa. To the stables, Atso, to the stables. And what if the abbot finds us? We will pretend to be a pair of ghosts. To me this did not seem a practical solution, but I kept silent. William was growing uneasy. We came out of the north door and crossed the cemetery, while the wind was whistling loudly and I begged the Lord not to make us encounter two ghosts, for the abbey, on that night, did not lack for souls in torment. We reached the stables and heard the horses, more nervous than ever because of the fury of the elements. The main door of the building had, at the level of a man's chest, a broad metal grating, through which the interior could be seen. In the darkness we discerned the forms of the horses. I recognized Brunellus, the first on the left. To his right, the third animal in line raised his head, sensing our presence, and whinnied. I smiled. Tertius equi, I said. What? William asked. Nothing. I was remembering poor Salvatore. He wanted to perform God knows what magic with that horse, and with his Latin he called him Tertius equi. Which would be the ewe? The ewe? Asked William, who had heard my prattle without paying much attention to it. Yes, because in good Latin Tertius equi doesn't mean the third horse, but the third of the horse, or the third letter of the word equus, which is therefore the ewe. But this is all nonsense. William looked at me, and in the darkness I seemed to see his face transformed. God bless you, Atso, he said to me. Why, of course, suppositio materialis. The discourse is presumed to dicto and not to re. What a fool I am. He gave himself such a great blow on the forehead that I heard a clap, and I believe he hurt himself. My boy, this is the second time today that wisdom has spoken through your mouth, first in dream and now waking. Run to your cell and fetch the lamp, or, rather, both the lamps we hid. Let no one see you, and join me in church at once. Ask no questions. Go. I asked no questions and went. The lamps were under my bed, already filled with oil, and I had taken care to trim them in advance. I had the flint in my habit. With the two precious instruments clutched to my chest, I ran into the church. William was under the tripod and was rereading the parchment with Fernandes' notes. Atso, he said to me, primum et septimum de quature does not mean the first and seventh of four, but of the four, the word for. For a moment I still did not understand, but then I was enlightened. Super phronos viginti quature, the writing, the verse. The words are carved over the mirror. Come, William said, perhaps we are still in time to save a life. Whose? I asked, as he was manipulating the skulls and opening the passage to the assarium. The life of someone who does not deserve it, he said. We were already in the underground passage, our lamps alight, moving toward the door that led to the kitchen. I said before that at this point you pushed a wooden door and found yourself in the kitchen, behind the fireplace, at the foot of the circular staircase that led to the scriptorium. And just as we were pushing that door, we heard to our left some muffled sounds within the wall. They came from the wall beside the door, where the row of niches with skulls and bones ended. Instead of a last niche, there was a stretch of blank wall of large squared blocks of stone, with an old plaque in the center that had some worn monograms carved on it. The sounds came, it seemed, from behind the plaque, or else from above the plaque, partly beyond the wall, and partly almost over our heads. If something of the sort had happened the first night, I would immediately have thought of dead monks. But by now I tended to expect worse from living monks. Who can that be? I asked. William opened the door and emerged behind the fireplace. The blows were heard also along the wall that flanked the stairs, as if someone were prisoner inside the wall, or else in that thickness, truly vast, that presumably existed between the inner wall of the kitchen and the outer wall of the south tower. Someone is shut up inside there, William said. I have wondered all along whether there were not another access to the finest Africi, in this edificium so full of passages. Obviously there is. From the osarium, before you come up into the kitchen, a stretch of wall opens, and you climb up a staircase parallel to this, concealed in the wall, which leads right to the blind room. But who is in there? The second person. One is in the finest Africi, another has tried to reach him, but the one above must have blocked the mechanism that controls the entrances. So the visitor is trapped. And he is making a great stir because, I imagine, there cannot be much air in that narrow space. Who is it? We must save him. We shall soon know who it is. And as for saving him, that can only be done by releasing the mechanism from above. We don't know the secret at this end. Let's hurry upstairs. So we went up to the scriptorium, and from there to the labyrinth, and we quickly reached the south tower. Twice I had to curb my haste, because the wind that came through the slits that night created currents that, penetrating those passages, blew moaning through the rooms, rustling the scattered pages on the desks, so that I had to shield the flame with my hand. Soon we were in the mirror room, this time prepared for the game of distortion awaiting us. We raised the lamps to illuminate the verse that surmounted the frame. Super Thronos Viginti Quacha. At this point the secret was quite clear. The word Quacha has 7 letters, and we had to press on the Q and the R. I thought, in my excitement, to do it myself. I rapidly set the lamp down on the table in the center of the room. But I did this nervously, and the flame began to lick the binding of a book also set there. Watch out, idiot! William cried, and with a puff blew out the flame. You want to set fire to the library? I apologized and started to light the lamp again. It doesn't matter, William said. Mine is enough. Take it and give me light, because the legend is too high and you couldn't reach it. We must hurry. And what if there is somebody armed in there? I asked, as William, almost groping, sought the fatal letters, standing on tiptoe, tall as he was, to touch the apocalyptic verse. Give me light, by the devil, and never fear. God is with us, he answered me, somewhat incoherently. His fingers were touching the Q of Quacha, and, standing a few paces back, I saw better than he what he was doing. I have already said that the letters of the verses seemed carved or incised in the wall. Apparently those of the word Quacha were metal outlines, behind which a wondrous mechanism had been placed and walled up. When it was pushed forward, the Q made a kind of sharp click, and the same thing happened when William pressed on the R. The whole frame of the mirror seemed to shudder, and the glass surface snapped back. The mirror was a door, hinged on its left side. William slipped his hand into the opening now created between the right edge and the wall, and pulled toward himself. Creaking, the door opened out, in our direction. William slipped through the opening and I scuttled behind him, the lamp high over my head. 2 hours after Compline, at the end of the 6th day, in the heart of the night that was giving birth to the 7th day, we entered the finest Africi. Night, in which the ekpyrosis takes place, and because of excess virtue the forces of hell prevail. The old man was silent. He held both hands open on the book, as if caressing its pages, flattening them the better to read them, or as if he wanted to protect the book from a raptor's talons. All of this, in any case, has been to no avail, William said to him. Now it is over. I have found you, I have found the book, and the others died in vain. Not in vain, Jorge said. Perhaps there were too many of them. And if you needed proof that this book is accursed, you have had it. And to ensure they have not died in vain, one more death will not be too many. He spoke, and with his fleshless, diaphanous hands he began slowly tearing to strips and shreds the limp pages of the manuscript, stuffing them into his mouth, slowly swallowing as if he were consuming the host and he wanted to make it flesh of his flesh. William looked at him, fascinated, and seemed not to grasp what was happening. Then he recovered himself and leaned forward, shouting, "What are you doing?" Jorge smiled, baring his bloodless gums, as a yellowish slime trickled from his pale lips over the sparse white hairs on his chin. You were awaiting the sound of the 7th trumpet, were you not? Now listen to what the voice says, seal what the 7 thunders have said and do not write it, take and devour it, it will make bitter your belly but to your lips it will be sweet as honey. You see. Now I seal that which was not to be said, in the grave I become. He laughed, Jorge. For the first time I heard him laugh. He laughed with his throat, though his lips did not assume the shape of gaiety, and he seemed almost to be weeping. You did not expect it, William, not this conclusion, did you? This old man, by the grace of God, wins once more, does he not? And as William tried to take the book away from him, Jorge, who sensed the movement, feeling the vibration of the air, drew back, clasping the volume to his chest with his left hand while his right went on tearing the pages and cramming them into his mouth. He was on the other side of the table, and William, who could not reach him, tried abruptly to move around the obstacle. But he knocked over his stool, catching his habit in it, so that Jorge was able to perceive the disturbance. The old man laughed again, louder this time, and with unexpected rapidity thrust out his right hand, groping for the lamp. Guided by the heat, he reached the flame and pressed his hand over it, unafraid of pain, and the light went out. The room was plunged into darkness, and for the last time we heard the laughter of Jorge, who said, "Find me now. Now I am the one who sees best." Then he was silent and did not make another sound, moving with those silent footsteps that always made his appearances so unexpected. And we heard only, from time to time, in different parts of the room, the sound of the tearing paper. "Atsu!" William cried. "Stay by the door. Don't let him go out." But he had spoken too late, because I, who for some moments had been yearning to fling myself on the old man, had jumped forward when the darkness fell, trying to circle the table on the side opposite the one around which my master had moved. Too late I realized I had enabled Jorge to gain the door, because the old man could move in the dark with extraordinary confidence. We heard a sound of tearing paper behind us, somewhat muffled, because it came from the next room. And at the same time we heard another sound, a harsh, progressive creaking, the groan of hinges. "The mirror!" William cried. "He is shutting us inside." Led by the sound, we both rushed toward the entrance. I stumbled over a stool and bruised my leg but paid no heed, because in a flash I realized that if Jorge shut us in we would never get out. In the darkness we would never find the way to open the door, not knowing what had to be maneuvered on this side, or how. I believe William moved with the same desperation as I did, because I felt him beside me as both of us, reaching the threshold, pressed ourselves against the back of the mirror, which was closing toward us. We arrived in time. The door stopped, then gave way and reopened. Obviously Jorge, sensing the conflict was unequal, had left. We came out of the accursed room, but now we had no idea where the old man was heading, and the darkness was still complete. All of a sudden I remembered, "Master, I have the flint with me. What are you waiting for, then?" William cried. "Find the lamp and light it." I rushed back in the darkness, into the finest Afrique, groping for the lamp. I found it at once, by divine miracle, then dug inside my scapula and pulled out the flint. My hands were trembling, and 2 or 3 times I failed before I was able to light it, as William gasped at the door, "Hurry, hurry." Finally I made a light. "Hurry," William urged me again. "Otherwise the old man will eat up all of Aristotle, and die." I cried in anguish, overtaking him and joining in the search. "I don't care whether he dies, damn the monster," William cried, peering in every direction, moving at random. "With what he has eaten, his fate is already sealed. But I want the book." Then he stopped and added, more calmly, "Wait. If we continue like this, we'll never find him." "Hush." Will remained still for a moment. We stiffened, in silence. And in the silence we heard, not far away, the sound of a body bumping into a case, and the racket of some falling books. "That way," we shouted, together. We ran in the direction of the noise, but soon realized we would have to slow our pace. In fact, outside the finest Afrique, the library was filled that evening with gusts of air that hissed and moaned, in proportion to the strong wind outside. Heightened by our speed, they threatened to put out our light, so painfully recovered. Since we could not move faster, we would have to make Jorge move more slowly. But William had just the opposite idea and shouted, "We've caught you, old man. Now we have light." And it was a wise decision, because the revelation probably upset Jorge, who moved faster, compromising his magic sensibility, his gift for seeing in the darkness. Soon we heard another noise, and, following it, when we entered room Y of Hispania, we saw him lying on the floor, the book still in his hands, as he attempted to pull himself to his feet among the books that had spilled from the table he had struck and overturned. He was trying to stand, but he went on tearing the pages, determined to devour his prey as quickly as possible. By the time we overtook him he was on his feet. Sensing our presence, he confronted us, moving backward. His face, in the reddish glow of the lamp, now seemed horrible to us. The features were distorted, a malignant sweat streaked his brown cheeks, his eyes, usually a deathly white, were bloodshot, from his mouth came scraps of parchment, and he looked like a ravening beast who had stuffed himself and could no longer swallow his food. Disfigured by anxiety, by the menace of the poison now flowing abundantly through his veins, by his desperate and diabolical determination, the venerable figure of the old man now seemed disgusting and grotesque. At other moments he might have inspired laughter, but we, too, were reduced to the condition of animals, dogs stalking their quarry. We could have taken him calmly, but we fell on him with violence. He writhed, clasped his hands on his chest to defend the volume. I grasped him with my left hand while with my right I tried to hold the lamp high, but I grazed his face with the flame. He sensed the heat, let out a muffled cry, almost a roar, as bits of paper spilled from his mouth, and his right hand let go of the volume, darted toward the lamp, and abruptly tore it from me, flinging it away. The lamp fell right on the pile of books that had been knocked from the table all in a heap, lying open. The oil spilled out. The fire immediately seized a fragile parchment, which blazed up like a bundle of dry twigs. Everything happened in a few moments, as if for centuries those ancient pages had been yearning for arson and were rejoicing in the sudden satisfaction of an unfulfilled thirst for ekpyrosis. William realized what was happening and let go of the old man, who, feeling himself free, stepped back a few paces. William hesitated an instant, most likely too long, uncertain whether to seize Jorge again or to hasten to put out the little pyre. One book, older than the others, burned almost immediately, sending up a ton of flame. The fine gusts of the wind, which might have extinguished a weak flicker, encouraged the stronger, livelier flame, and even carried sparks flying from it. "Put out that fire, quickly," William cried. "Everything will burn up." I rushed toward the blaze, then stopped, because I was unsure what to do. William again moved after me, to come to my aid. We held out our hands as our eyes sought something to smother the fire. I had a flash of inspiration. I slipped my habit over my head and tried to throw it on the heart of the fire. But the flames by now were too high. They consumed my garment and were nourished by it. Snatching back my scorched hands, I turned toward William and saw Jorge, who had approached again, directly behind him. The heat was now so strong that the old man could feel it very easily, so he knew with absolute certainty where the fire was. He flung the Aristotle into it. In an explosion of ire, William gave the old man a violent push. Jorge slammed into a case, banging his head against one corner. He fell to the ground. But William, whom I believe I heard utter a horrible curse, paid no heed to him. He turned to the books. Too late. The Aristotle, or what had remained of it after the old man's meal, was already burning. Meanwhile, some sparks had flown toward the walls, and already the volumes of another bookcase were crumpling in the fury of the fire. By now, not one but two fires were burning in the room. William, realizing we would not be able to put them out with our hands, decided to use books to save books. He seized a volume that seemed to him more stoutly bound than the others, more compact, and he tried to use it as a weapon to stifle the hostile element. But, slamming the studded binding on the pyre of glowing books, he merely stirred more sparks. Though he tried to scatter them with his feet, he achieved the opposite effect. Fluttering scraps of parchment, half burned, rose and hovered like bats, while the air, allied with its airy fellow element, sent them to kindle the terrestrial matter of further pages. As misfortune would have it, this was one of the most untidy rooms of the labyrinth. Rolled-up manuscripts hung from the shelves, other books, falling apart, let pages slip from their covers, as from gaping mouths, tons of vellum dried up by the years, and the table must have held a great number of writings that Malachi, by then unassisted for some days, had neglected to put back in their places. So the room, after the spill Jorge caused, was invaded by parchments waiting only to be transformed into another element. In no time the place was a brazier, a burning bush. The bookcases themselves also joined in this sacrifice and were beginning to crackle. I realized the whole labyrinth was nothing but an immense sacrificial pyre, all prepared for the first spark. "Water. We need water," William was saying, but then he added, "But where can any water be found in this inferno?" "In the kitchen, down in the kitchen," I cried. William looked at me, puzzled, his face flushed by that raging glow. "Yes, but by the time we've gone down and come back up." "The devil take it," he then cried. "This room is lost, in any case, and perhaps the next one as well. Let's go down at once. I'll find water, and you rush out to give the alarm. We need a lot of people." We found the way toward the stairs. The conflagration lighted the subsequent rooms as well, but more and more faintly, so we crossed the last two almost groping again. Below, the moon dimly illuminated the scriptorium, and from there we went down to the refectory. William rushed into the kitchen, I to the refectory door, fumbling to open it from the inside. I succeeded after a fair amount of labor, for my agitation made me clumsy and inept. I stepped out onto the grass, ran toward the dormitory, then realized I could not wake the monks one by one. I had an inspiration. I went into the church, hunting for the access to the bell tower. When I found it, I grabbed all the ropes, ringing the alarm. I pulled hard, and the central bell rope, as it rose, drew me up with it. In the library, the backs of my hands had been burned. My palms were still unhurt, but now I burned them, too, letting them slip along the ropes until they bled and I had to let go. By then, however, I had made enough noise. I rushed outside in time to see the first monks coming from the dormitory, as I heard in the distance the voices of the servants, who were appearing at the doors of their lodgings. I could not explain myself clearly, because I was unable to formulate words, and the first that came to my lips were in my mother tongue. With bleeding hand I pointed to the windows of the south wing of the edificium, at whose alabaster panes there was an abnormal glow. I realized, from the intensity of the light, that the fire had spread to other rooms while I had come down and rung the bells. All the windows of Africa and the whole facade between it and the east tower now flickered with irregular flashes. "Water! Fetch water!" I shouted. At first no one understood. The monks were so used to considering the library a sacred and inaccessible place that they could not understand it was threatened by the sort of banal accident that might have befallen a peasant hut. The first who looked up at the windows blessed themselves, murmuring words of fear, and I realized they were thinking of further apparitions. I grabbed their clothing and begged them to understand, until someone finally translated my sobs into human words. It was Nicholas of Moromondo, who said, "The library is on fire." "It is, indeed," I whispered, sinking to the ground, exhausted. Nicholas displayed great energy, shouted orders to the servants, gave advice to the monks surrounding him, sent some to open the other doors of the edificium, others to seek water and vessels of every kind. He directed those present toward the wells and the water tanks of the abbey. He ordered the cowherds to use the mules and asses to transport jars. If a man invested with authority had given these orders, he would have been obeyed at once. But the servants were accustomed to taking orders from Remigio, the scribes from Malachi, all of them from the abbot. And, alas, none of those three was present. The monks looked around for the abbot, to ask instructions and solace, and did not find him. Only I knew that he was dead, or dying, at that moment, shut up in an airless passage that was now turning into an oven, a ball of Phalaris. Nicholas shoved the cowherds in one direction, but some other monks, with the best of intentions, pushed them in another. Some of the brothers had obviously lost their heads, others were still dazed with sleep. I tried to explain, now that I had recovered the power of speech, but it must be remembered that I was almost naked, having thrown my habit on the flames, and the sight of a boy, as I was then, bleeding, his face smudged by soot, his body indecently hairless, numbed now by the cold, surely did not inspire much confidence. Finally Nicholas managed to drag a few brothers and some other men into the kitchen, which in the meantime someone had opened. Another monk had the good sense to bring some torches. We found the place in great disorder, and I realized William must have turned it upside down, seeking water and vessels to carry it. At that point I saw William himself appear from the door of the refectory, his face singed, his habit smoking. He was carrying a large pot in his hand, and I felt pity for him, pathetic allegory of helplessness. I realized that even if he had succeeded in carrying a pan of water to the second floor without spilling it, and even if he had done so more than once, he could have achieved very little. I recalled the story of St. Augustine, when he saw a boy trying to scoop up the water of the sea with a spoon. The boy was an angel and did this to make fun of a saint who wanted to understand the mysteries of the divine nature. And, like the angel, William spoke to me, leaning in exhaustion against the door jamb. "It is impossible, we will never do it, not even with all the monks of the abbey. The library is lost." Unlike the angel, William wept. I hugged him, as he tore a cloth from a table and tried to cover me. We stopped and, finally defeated, observed what was going on around us. There was a confused bustle, people going up the spiral staircase barehanded and encountering others, barehanded, who had been driven upstairs by their curiosity and were now coming down to look for vessels. Others, cleverer, had immediately started hunting for pans and basins, only to realize there was not sufficient water in the kitchen. Suddenly the great room was invaded by mules, bearing huge jars, and the cowherds driving the animals unloaded them and started to carry up the water. But they did not know how to climb to the scriptorium, and it was a while before some of the scribes told them, and when they went up they bumped into others rushing down, terrified. Jars broke and the water spread over the ground, though other jars were passed up the stairs by willing hands. I followed the group and found myself in the scriptorium. Thick smoke came from the access to the library. The last men who had tried to go up to the east tower were already coming down, coughing, red-eyed, and they announced it was no longer possible to penetrate that hell. Then I saw Benno. His face distorted. He was coming up from the lower floor with an enormous vessel. He heard what those coming down were saying and he attacked them. "Hell will swallow you all, cowards." He turned, as if seeking help, and saw me. "Adzo," he cried, the library. He did not await my answer, but ran to the foot of the stairs and boldly plunged into the smoke. That was the last time I saw him. I heard a creaking sound from above. The abbey burned for 3 days and 3 nights, and the last efforts were of no avail. As early as that morning of the 7th day of our sojourn in that place, when the survivors were fully aware that no building could be saved, when the finest constructions showed only their ruined outer walls, and the church, as if drawing into itself, swallowed its tower, even at that point everyone's will to combat the divine chastisement failed. The rush for the last few buckets of water grew more and more listless, while the chapter house and the superb apartments of the abbot were still quietly burning. By the time the fire reached the far side of the various workshops, the servants had long since saved as many objects as they could, and had chosen to beat the countryside to recapture at least some of the livestock, which had fled beyond the walls in the confusion of the night. I saw some of the servants venture into what remained of the church. I presumed they were trying to get into the crypt to seize some precious object before running away. I do not know whether they succeeded, whether the crypt had not already collapsed, whether the louts did not sink into the bowels of the earth in their attempt to reach the treasure. Meanwhile, men were coming up from the village to lend a hand or to try to snatch some further booty. The dead for the most part remained among the ruins, which were still red hot. On the 3rd day, when the wounded had been treated and the corpses found outside had been buried, the monks and all the others collected their belongings and abandoned the still smoking abbey, as a place accursed. They scattered, I do not know where to. William and I left those parts on 2 horses we found astray in the wood. We considered them residential Nilayas by now. We headed east. When we reached Bobbio again, we began to receive bad news of the emperor. On arriving in Rome, he had been crowned by the people. Considering any agreement with John now impossible, he had chosen an antipope, Nicholas V. Marsilius had been named spiritual vicar of Rome, but through his fault, or his weakness, things very sad to report were taking place in that city. Priests loyal to the pope and unwilling to say mass were tortured. An Augustinian prior had been thrown into the lion's pit on the Capitoline. Marsilius and John of Jandun had declared John a heretic, and Louis had had him sentenced to death. But the emperor's misrule was antagonizing the local lords and depleting public funds. Gradually, as we heard this news, we delayed our descent to Rome, and I realized that William did not want to find himself witnessing events that would dash his hopes. When we came to Pomposa, we learned that Rome had rebelled against Louis, who had moved back up toward Pisa, while John's legates were triumphantly entering the papal city. Meanwhile, Michael of Cesena had realized that his presence in Avignon was producing no results indeed. He feared for his life, so he had fled, joining Louis in Pisa. Soon, foreseeing events and learning that the Bavarian would move on to Munich, we reversed our route and decided to proceed there, also because William sensed that Italy was becoming unsafe for him. In the ensuing months and years, Louis saw the alliance of his supporters, the Ghibelline lords, dissolve, and the following year the antipope Nicholas was to surrender to John, presenting himself with a rope around his neck. When we came to Munich, I had to take leave of my good master, amid many tears. His destiny was uncertain, and my family preferred for me to return to Melk. After that tragic night when William revealed to me his dismay before the ruins of the abbey, as if by tacit agreement we had not spoken again of that story, nor did we mention it in the course of our sorrowful farewell. My master gave me much good advice about my future studies, and presented me with the glasses Nicholas had made for him, since he had his own back again. I was still young, he said to me, but one day they would come in handy, and, truly, I am wearing them as I write these lines. Then he embraced me with a father's tenderness and dismissed me. I never saw him again. I learned much later that he had died during the Great Plague that raged through Europe toward the middle of this century. I pray always that God received his soul and forgave him the many acts of pride that his intellectual vanity had made him commit. Years later, as a grown man, I had occasion to make a journey to Italy, sent by my abbot. I could not resist temptation, and on my return I went far out of my way to revisit what remained of the abbey. The 2 villages on the slopes of the mountain were deserted, the lands around them uncultivated. When I climbed up to the top, a spectacle of desolation and death appeared before my eyes, which moistened with tears. Of the great and magnificent constructions that once adorned that place, only scattered ruins remained, as had happened before with the monuments of the ancient pagans in the city of Rome. Ivy covered the shreds of walls, columns, the few architraves still intact. Weeds invaded the ground on all sides, and there was no telling where the vegetables and the flowers had once grown. Only the location of the cemetery was recognizable, because of some graves that still rose above the level of the terrain. Sole sign of life, some birds of prey hunted lizards and serpents that, like basilisks, slithered among the stones or crawled over the walls. Of the church door only a few traces remained, eroded by mold. Half of the tympanum survived, and I still glimpsed there, dilated by the elements and dulled by lichens, the left eye of the enthroned Christ, and something of the lion's face. The edificium, except for the south wall, which was in ruins, seemed yet to stand and defy the course of time. The 2 outer towers, over the cliff, appeared almost untouched, but all the windows were empty sockets whose slimy tiers were rotting vines. Inside, the work of art, destroyed, became confused with the work of nature, and across vast stretches of the kitchen the eye ran to the open heavens through the breach of the upper floors and the roof, fallen like fallen angels. Everything that was not green with moss was still black from the smoke of so many decades ago. Poking about in the rubble, I found at times scraps of parchment that had drifted down from the scriptorium and the library and had survived like treasures buried in the earth. I began to collect them, as if I were going to piece together the torn pages of a book. Then I noticed that in one of the towers there rose, tottering but still intact, a circular staircase to the scriptorium, and from there, by climbing a sloping bit of the ruin, I could reach the level of the library, which, however, was only a sort of gallery next to the outside walls, looking down into the void at every point. Along one stretch of wall I found a bookcase, still miraculously erect, having come through the fire I cannot say how. It was rotted by water and consumed by insects. In it there were still a few pages. Other remnants I found by rummaging in the ruins below. Mine was a poor harvest, but I spent a whole day reaping it, as if from those dissector membra of the library a message might reach me. Some fragments of parchment had faded, others permitted the glimpse of an image's shadow, or the ghost of one or more words. At times I found pages where whole sentences were legible, more often, intact bindings, protected by what had once been metal studs. Ghosts of books, apparently intact on the outside but consumed within, yet sometimes a half page had been saved, an incipit was discernible, a title. I collected every relic I could find, filling 2 traveling sacks with them, abandoning things useful to me in order to save that miserable hoard. Along the return journey and afterward at Milk, I spent many hours trying to decipher those remains. Often from a word or a surviving image I could recognize what the work had been. When I found, in time, other copies of those books, I studied them with love, as if destiny had left me this bequest, as if having identified the destroyed copy were a clear sign from heaven that said to me, Toli et lege. At the end of my patient reconstruction, I had before me a kind of lesser library, a symbol of the greater, vanished one. A library made up of fragments, quotations, unfinished sentences, amputated stumps of books. The more I reread this list, the more I am convinced it is the result of chance and contains no message. But these incomplete pages have accompanied me through all the life that has been left me to live since then. I have often consulted them like an oracle, and I have almost had the impression that what I have written on these pages is a cento, a figured hymn, an immense acrostic that says and repeats nothing but what those fragments have suggested to me, nor do I know whether thus far I have been speaking of them or they have spoken through my mouth. But whichever of the 2 possibilities may be correct, the more I repeat to myself the story that has emerged from them, the less I manage to understand whether in it there is a design that goes beyond the natural sequence of the events and the times that connect them. And it is a hard thing for this old monk, on the threshold of death, not to know whether the letter he has written contains some hidden meaning, or more than one, or many, or none at all. But this inability of mine to see is perhaps the effect of the shadow that the great darkness, as it approaches, is casting on the aged world. Ist ubi gloria nunc Babylonii? Where are the snows of yesteryear? The earth is dancing the dance of macabre. At times it seems to me that the Danube is crowded with ships loaded with fools going toward a dark place. The novel as cosmological event. What I mean is that to tell a story you must first of all construct a world, furnished as much as possible, down to the slightest details. If I were to construct a river, I would need 2 banks, and if on the left bank I put a fisherman, and if I were to give this fisherman a wrathful character and a police record, then I could start writing, translating into words everything that would inevitably happen. What does a fisherman do? He fishes, and thence a whole sequence of actions, more or less obligatory. And then what happens? Either the fish are biting or they are not. If they bite, the fisherman catches them and then goes home happy. End of story. If there are no fish, since he is a wrathful type, he will perhaps become angry. Perhaps he will break his fishing rod. This is not much, still, it is already a sketch. But there is an Indian proverb that goes, sit on the bank of a river and wait, your enemy's corpse will soon float by. And what if the corpse were to come down the stream, since this possibility is inherent in an intertextual area like a river? We must also bear in mind that my fisherman has a police record. Will he want to risk trouble? What will he do? Will he run away and pretend not to have seen the corpse? Will he feel vulnerable, because this, after all, is the corpse of the man he hated? Wrathful as he is, will he fly into a rage because he was not able to wreak personally his longed-for vengeance? As you see, as soon as one's invented world has been furnished just a little, there is already the beginning of a story. There is already the beginning of a style, too, because a fisherman who is fishing should establish a slow, fluvial pace, cadenced by his waiting, which should be patient but also marked by the fits of his impatient wrath. The problem is to construct the world. The words will practically come on their own. Orientim, verba sequenta. Grasp the subject, and the words will follow. This, I believe, is the opposite of what happens with poetry, which is more a case of verba team, residential sequenta. Grasp the words, and the subject will follow. The first year of work on my novel was devoted to the construction of the world. Long registers of all the books that could be found in a medieval library, lists of names and personal data for many characters, a number of whom were then excluded from the story. In other words, I had to know who the rest of the monks were, those who do not appear in the book. It was not necessary for the reader to know them, but I had to know them. Whoever said that fiction must compete with the city directory? Perhaps it must also compete with the planning board. Therefore I conducted long architectural investigations, studying photographs and floor plans in the Encyclopedia of Architecture, to establish the arrangement of the abbey, the distances, even the number of steps in a spiral staircase. The film director Marco Ferreri once said to me that my dialogue is like a movie's because it lasts exactly the right length of time. It had to. When 2 of my characters spoke while walking from the refectory to the cloister, I wrote with the plan before my eyes, and when they reached their destination, they stopped talking. It is necessary to create constraints, in order to invent freely. In poetry the constraint can be imposed by meter, foot, rhyme, by what has been called the verse according to the ear. See Charles Orson, Projective Verse, Poetry New York 3, 1950. In fiction, the surrounding world provides the constraint. This has nothing to do with realism, even if it explains also realism. A completely unreal world can be constructed, in which asses fly and princesses are restored to life by a kiss. But that world, purely possible and unrealistic, must exist according to structures defined at the outset. We have to know whether it is a world where a princess can be restored to life only by the kiss of a prince, or also by that of a witch, and whether the princess's kiss transforms only frogs into princes or also, for example, armadillos. One element of my world was history, and that is why I read and reread so many medieval chronicles, and as I read them, I realized that the novel had to include things that, in the beginning, had never crossed my mind, such as the debate over poverty and the Inquisition's hostility toward the Fraticelli. For example, why are the 14th century Fraticelli in my book? If I had to write a medieval story, I ought to have set it in the 12th or 13th century, because I knew them better than the 14th. But I needed an investigator, English if possible, intertextual quotation, with a great gift of observation and a special sensitivity in interpreting evidence. These qualities could be found only among the Franciscans, and only after Roger Bacon. Furthermore, we find a developed theory of signs only with the Ockhamites. Or, rather, it also existed before, but either the interpretation of signs then was of a symbolic nature or else it tended to read ideas and notions in signs. It is only between Bacon and Ockham that signs are used to acquire knowledge of individuals. So I had to set the story in the 14th century, much to my irritation, because I could not move easily in that period. More reading ensued, with the discovery that a 14th century Franciscan, even an Englishman, could not ignore the debate about poverty, especially if he was a friend, follower, or acquaintance of Ockham. I might add that initially the investigator was to have been Ockham himself, but I gave up that idea, because I do not find the venerable inceptor very attractive as a human being. But why does everything take place at the end of November 1327? Because by December, Michael of Cesena is already in Avignon. This is what I mean by furnishing a world in a historical novel. Some elements, like the number of steps, can be determined by the author, but others, like the movements of Michael, depend on the real world, which, in this kind of novel, happens to coincide with the possible world of the story. But November is too early. I also needed to have a pig slaughtered. Why? The answer is simple, so that the corpse could be thrust, head down, into a great jar of blood. And why did I need this? Because the second trumpet of the apocalypse says, I could not change the apocalypse, after all, it was a part of this world. Now, it so happens, I made inquiries, that pigs are not slaughtered until cold weather comes, and November might be too early unless I situated the abbey in the mountains, so there would already be snow. Otherwise my story might have taken place in the plains, at Pomposa, or at Conques. The constructed world will then tell us how the story must proceed. Everyone asks me why my Jorge, with his name, suggests Borges, and why Borges is so wicked. But I cannot say. I wanted a blind man who guarded a library, it seemed a good narrative idea to me, and library plus blind man can only equal Borges, also because debts must be paid. And, further, it was through Spanish commentaries and illumination that the apocalypse influenced the entire Middle Ages. But when I put Jorge in the library I did not yet know he was the murderer. He acted on his own, so to speak. And it must not be thought that this is an idealistic position, as if I were saying that the characters have an autonomous life and the author, in a kind of trance, makes them behave as they themselves direct him. That kind of nonsense belongs in term papers. The fact is that the characters are obliged to act according to the laws of the world in which they live. In other words, the narrator is the prisoner of his own premises. Another fine story was that of the labyrinth. All the labyrinths I had heard of, and I had Santa Candeli's excellent study at hand, were outdoor labyrinths. They could be extremely complicated and full of circumvolutions. But I needed an indoor labyrinth. Have you ever seen an open-air library? And if it was too complicated, with too many passages and inner rooms, not enough air would circulate, whereas circulation of air was necessary to feed the fire. This, the fact that the edificium had to burn at the end, was very clear to me, but also for cosmological historical reasons. In the Middle Ages, cathedrals and convents burned like tinder. Imagining a medieval story without a fire is like imagining a World War II movie in the Pacific without a fighter plane shot down in flames. So after I had worked for 2 or 3 months constructing a suitable labyrinth, I ended up having to add some slits to make absolutely sure there would be enough air.